My name is Randy. That's my social media handle, where I create creative ID, curate my expression out in the world. I'll just tell you about myself for just a few brief moments to sort of set the context for what will come next. Of course, this is like the highlight reel. In like 2007, I co-founded this e-commerce marketplace called Supermarket in Brooklyn. And it was the first time that I'd been able to sort of design everything in an experience. I'd done a lot of sort of client service design work before then, and I'd always wanted to, always trying to push that brief to something bigger, you know? It's like when they came with this, you're like, but this and that, yeah? You're like, sure, we can build that website, but gosh, your identity really sucks. It would be, sure would be more proud of that website if we could, help you with that. And every once in a while, I'll succeed in somehow expanding the scope of the project, but oftentimes not, you know? And I think a lot of that body of work from that studio was sort of good but not great, kind of through my like critical lens. And that was one of those reasons. So it was this super neat thing when we started this company that, because it was ours, we did everything. You know, we wrote all the copy, we designed all the stuff, wrote the vast majority of the sort of the front end code, which meant like all made sense to me. I wasn't having to like pick apart someone else's stuff. It feels super dated now, and I show this like reference images, but at the time, it was awesome. And that really set me down a bunch of different paths about sort of never wanting to do client service work again, and sort of starting to think about products and services. But it was really that first time that I felt like I could touch all the stuff and have an influence on things. And it's kind of one of maybe the skills that many designers have, but also like the affliction or the disease we end up with, which is like to want to do all this stuff. From Supermarket, I ended up joining Etsy, where I was there for almost 8 years leading design. And going in kind of a naive way, 8 years later, kind of worked out through a series of maybe intentional steps and luck and other things. I had this idea going in that I wanted to do that same thing. Like, what if we could touch all the parts of this thing that was sort of a much bigger canvas, that already had a much bigger audience, that seemed to have a far bigger sort of growth trajectory than the business you were working on before. And I kind of had this long view mindset about it, you know, that it would be there for a while. This might be a several-year project, and so I was sort of able to be patient about getting to all those things. And so what started with kind of like, make this website not suck. It was like really like very, very much where it was at the beginning. It was sort of crippled under its own success, and it was quite confusing, but the people who loved it would use it even though it was confusing, and sort of bring it somewhere else to then slowly sort of like adding in other like disciplines and modes of working until we built, you know, this like 7 years later, this like 100-person design organization that sort of represented so many ways of getting close to designing all of the stuff, like designing everything. You know, interiors for the headquarters and tons of like methodological evolution to be much more centered around like users and sort of co-designing as part of the experience. That was super awesome, sort of canvas for that thinking. After that, for about 1.5 years, I spent time at Artsy, unrelated to Etsy, other than its very derivative name, yeah. That's okay. And lots of similar dynamics, two-sided marketplace on the web, like maybe taking some offline activities and bringing them online. Smaller resources, while similar in creativity, some vague creativity space, very different sort of customer profiles and purchase considerations and communication norms and all sorts of things. And there I like, again, in a way, I was kind of like, let's try this again in this other context, maybe in a space where the core aesthetic was more appealing to me personally. Like, that would be interesting to feel kind of personally invested in it, maybe differently, where like Etsy felt like it was for someone else. And in some ways, I think in hindsight, this was not successful. This like attempt to sort of expand into the many modes of delivery and execution kind of didn't work out in my experience there. It sort of stayed contained primarily in the product experience. We improved some things, yay, the metrics went up. That's, you know, we can feel proud of that work, but it didn't sort of scratch that itch I had to really get as expansive as I'd like. And then as Ariana mentioned, like, I don't know, very soon I'm moving to Singapore. It's weird. To lead design at this organization called Grab, which some of you may be familiar with and some of you have like never heard of until the second, as I'm learning. Grab is like the dominant ride-hailing company in Southeast Asia, and now like the dominant wallet, and you can get access to healthcare services and top up your utility bill, and sort of in this super app universe, kind of like WeChat or something like that. And this to me is like super exciting as that kind of design all these many, many parts of the experience. They're sort of inherently service experiences, even more than products probably, and many of them are about delivering something through a channel you don't have direct control over. Right? So lots of kind of like how do you shape human behavior in a series of influential little moments with design. Super excited about that. And so this is like an interesting context to talk with you today about this idea of trying to design sort of in all the channels, all the modes of delivery, for all the parts and types of the experience that a thing has the potential to be. Because I'm in this sort of transitional state and like kind of excited and mind tricking myself into confidence about what's coming up, I don't really know much about what's going to happen, and I've been mostly sort of reflective on some of the past experience I've had, what things might be relevant and applicable, and just how much I need to check the confidence in those experiences because the cultural context is so different. I'll pause for a second, and I just want to ask this question in the room, which is, how many of you would consider yourself a perfectionist? Yeah, okay, wow, yeah, awesome. Yeah. That was enough. 72%, I think, is what we got. Great. I have been, I used to think of myself as a perfectionist. I probably still do on some days. But for sure, I have had that term sort of put at me as almost like derogatory, right? Or I think it's a euphemism for slow, sometimes too, I think. It's like a very polite way to say you take too long. This is what my wife would say about me cooking dinner. It ends up pretty good at the end, but wow, you're like very hungry by the time the food is ready. I always underestimate it. It's like sprint planning or something. 30 minutes, and then 2.5 hours later, I finally sit down. So a different question for you, very unrelated, because I want to tell you this small story, which is, how many of you have seen the television sitcom Fresh Off the Boat? Yeah? Okay, great. So some of you, 37%, know what I'm talking about. So Fresh Off the Boat is the sort of based on a book by a guy named Eddie Huang, and it's like a personal story about like how his family in the early 90s moved from DC area to Orlando, Florida, as they're Taiwanese. His dad wanted to open up a restaurant in Orlando. It's kind of changed the family experience. But he grows up in Orlando, Florida, obsessed with, like Taiwanese American kid, obsessed with hip hop and Shaquille O'Neal, the Orlando Magic. I am not Taiwanese American, but my family moved from the DC area to Orlando, Florida in the late 80s. I was obsessed with hip hop and Orlando Magic. Shaquille O'Neal was my idol. And so much so that I collected all this memorabilia. I had like autographed basketballs and photographs and frames and all this like ephemera and things. And this is so absurd, but I will share this with you. I've not shared this with an audience before. I turned my bedroom, my like suburban Florida bedroom, into a Orlando Magic museum, basically. And my dad was always kind of into woodworking, like as a hobby and stuff. And my mother was very upset one weekend when she came home, and I had my dresser and desk from my bedroom out in the driveway, and I was using my dad's power sander to take the finish off them because I was going to paint them all black. Because the museum needed to have this sort of like neutral setting, like it couldn't look like this like wood was so tacky, So I painted all the furniture in my bedroom black. And I would stage up all the merchandise and memorabilia in a certain sequence. And then when my family or friends would come over, I would take them to the exhibit, and I would sort of guide them around, or you would kind of walk around the room counterclockwise. And I had cleverly hidden my bed under this like throw that had, the Orlando Magic logo on it. And like this is that like disease part of like wanting to create this total experience, right? That I probably had when I was, 10 years old or something. There's a 6-disc CD changer down in the thing, and I would put on either Shaq Fu to Return, which would be a second hip hop record, or there's a Fu Schnickens record where Shaquille O'Neal did lots of like guest verses. It was pretty dialed in, so we got the audio experience. I was really trying to like touch all the notes. And so I realized, I was like thinking about this, and I'm like, man, I have been trying to like make everything just right for so long, which is both this like really satisfying obsession, because when you get one more thing done and you check it off, it feels so like rewarding. You're like one step closer to that sort of totally conceived experience. And is also like absolutely like ridiculous. Yeah. And what a funny kind of like tension to have. It's some of that obsession and energy that I think has fed into some of the things I've done professionally that have worked out reasonably well, or that when I look back on, I'm like proud of. But what a weird way to kind of pass through the world, I think, or something, or like spend your days. And so, like, when I was the last time I was sort of making this professional transition, so a couple years ago, I was leaving this time at Etsy and going to Artsy. I had kind of, I think in the Etsy context, I was able to sort of expand the scope of design, primarily because of trusting relationships in the organization. Having a sort of healthy collaborative relationship with the CEO and being able to ask for things and not have to explain them so much as just being sort of assumed the intent was good and you could like try it and figure out. And so in some ways I never had to like pitch this idea in a really like salesy way. It was all built on these natural like healthy relationships. And also in the context of some business that's like growing at the time and everything's like lovely, it's easier to sort of like say yes to those things. So somewhat like privileged set of circumstances. Coming out of that, I got almost nervous or something that I wouldn't be able to do it again. Like I need to like up my game because then these next circumstances aren't going to be the same. I don't know these people. I don't have this like 7-year running relationship. There's not some proven track record that they've experienced firsthand that I can lean on as like a shorthand for anything. And so I attempted to kind of like put some words, some language, some thinking around this idea of this like complete design. I was calling it like a total design. And to give it some extra integrity, I went like out in the world and talked about it. I talked to some students in an interaction design program and some like comms designers at a big, large conference, one kind of like the scale or bigger or something. And I talked about it like to the public, which was an interesting one. I tried to like frame this concept in this design week in Alaska for a more like public audience, just to test out this idea and also see if I could communicate it to people in a meaningful way. I think that like the situation I found myself in is that it was perhaps over intellectualized or something, one of my other diseases. But I'll share with you just briefly. I'll share with you just briefly some of the highlights of how I was talking about that, because it's an important prelude to what comes next. So first I gave this idea of like, I gave it a name, Total Design, which is also an amazing design firm from the Netherlands, led by Wim Krauw, like in the 60s. Okay. I gave this definition. I said it's a practice, so it's like an action, of intentionally creating responses by addressing and considering every variable of every touch point in an experience. So I wanted to sort of cast this wide net and pitch a big enough tent that like other things could be included in it. So it sort of says every a few times, right? And is not specific about the medium or the channel. It's sort of response oriented. I want to make this thing happen, and any of the possible modes I might use to make that thing happen, I would use, like the Shaquille O'Neal CD in the museum exhibit in my bedroom. So I sort of authored some attributes of this thing. I'll move them quickly. I was saying that this total design is coherent, like somehow it makes an attempt to form a unified whole. So as you touch all these many, many different touch points, they're sort of adding up to a meaningful thing together. Right? It's not like a random collection of parts. I would reference like material design in some sense as like a system or an attempt to kind of pull things together in that way, maybe with varying degrees of success, but I think the intentions are there. Tried to explain this as some sort of like a best practice, to an audience that isn't thinking in these modes, that this would be sort of pitching it as an accepted norm. Right? The other thing, which was a little bit counterintuitive, is that I think the total design should have defined edges. Like even though while I'm saying everything, that is a somewhat foolish idea, and so you got to kind of pick the bounds in which you're going to like do all of the things, and leave some stuff sort of outside of it. To make it a little more conceptual, I was using something like Square as a payment service as an example of that more in the service concept. And I think that like Square has always been at its best when it's about paying and about that transaction moment. And when Square was trying to be about e-commerce or a marketplace, something just didn't kind of hold up. Those are sort of outside of its like coherent bounds of this total experience. But save maybe that, a couple little aberrations, I would argue that something like Square is quite a great like total design within its bounds, from the hardware to the branding to the name to the software experience. And like it's quite like, I would like to do things that feel that whole and complete. It seems great. I'd say that this total design is distinct. And why I think that is important is like you sort of need to recognize its wholeness in some way. So it needs to like, it cannot be invisible. It needs to somehow like present itself maybe in contrast to some other things. I think that like it or not, sort of like as a brand or something, I think like Tesla is a version of something like that. Like there's a level of distinctiveness. I mean, certainly in the leadership style and communications that sort of like creates it is magnetic even when it is like controversial or disappointing, but it can be like super exciting and compelling, and it's definitely distinct, right? It's one of the most powerful things that brand has going for it, and that no other auto brand does. Is like no other auto brand has like a personality, right? Or like a point of view. Strange personality, but sometimes likable. This was, I think that like the total design kind of like exists over time. So it can't sort of be like a flash in the pan in some way. So I think like it persists or endures with this asterisk, which is kind of like as long as you intend it to. I think that part of the design of a thing could be the designed intention for it to no longer be a thing. That doesn't really bode in a kind of like capitalist like mindset of like it always being like bigger and better, but that you could like design something to exist and then like not. I think is like sort of poetic version of designing everything. And then finally, this idea that like the total design would be authentic. That it would somehow have this sense like a feeling of integrity or trueness to itself. In the last, 18 or 24 months, I think the like sort of creative experience I had that felt most authentic and compelling to me was like seeing Solange in concert, and then it was like so good that I went and did it 2 more times. So it's kind of like the talk this morning. She's in our second song, and I'm like crying. I'm like, this is just like pop music, but it's like the most powerful and like beautiful like total conception of this thing I've like experienced in a long time. So I had these sort of these like 5 principles or like attributes. Then I'd bring examples, and I'd say like Disney World is like this total design. Disney, and like this is weighed heavily in my mind. We used to go to Disney World all the time too, so I wonder if that somehow like influenced my DNA. These things. I'd actually put some call out on Twitter at some point and said like, "Wow, what do you think would be an example of like this total design experience?" And the very first response I got was from this person. He was like, "Disney." But I like the identified things about kind of like transportation and getting to the hotel and your bags and all these little like touch points that are certainly like part of like maybe a service design concept, but aren't probably what you first think of when you think of Disney. I use this example of this like museum in, what's the name of the town in Arkansas? Bentonville, there you go, thank you. The Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is like this beautiful little like sort of private institution, but it kind of functions like a public one because it's all backed by like, Walmart family money. And it's a very like beautiful expression in this place, but it's sort of so expansive in its like designed intentions, the grounds and everything. The building is all designed by Moshe Safdie, amazing architect. They have this Frank Lloyd Wright building that they bought, like a Usonian home that they bought in New Jersey and rebuilt on site. It's incredible. The woman who gave the guided tours was also so endearing. She was obsessed with Frank Lloyd Wright. It was the sweetest thing. But what I thought was so interesting about Crystal Bridges as this sort of total design is that it really expanded itself beyond its property or its bounds, and how it influenced the town around it. And how things like this can really make a place and attract other creative endeavors, and the way the sort of the landscape architecture of the grounds and how they're integrated with the bike paths that are an important part of this community and things like that. All of these considerations have kind of planted this place or this institution in a way as a meaningful part of this community or something. Really checking off all these interesting little parts of what might be a total consideration. And then the last example I would use was this bar in this town north of New York City where I'd spend a lot of time. That was on one of these, Condé Nast Traveler best bars in America, number 2 or something. But it's an incredible place. It's called Back Bar. It's just in this old gas station building, in the back of it. Kind of looks like crap, How many different kinds of lighting can you have in one 18-foot span? But it feels so right, and it's I think So they have a sort of informal. It's very very with this informal mark the food you want on the paper thing. We've all been to places like that. That kind of helps it feel a little lo-fi. Food quality is crazy high, but it's all presented in this really lo-fi way. And there's kind of this concrete floor that's never been treated in some way. It's just super patinaed. Chairs are crazy beat up. And it was interesting for me to think about this place that felt so right and good to me as this total experience. Bless you. As this total experience, and how there's all these design choices. Many of them are about not doing anything or choosing not to intervene, right? You could have chosen those same chairs in their newly manufactured form, or you could choose the old ones and just let them be how they are. And some of them don't open up all that well, and they're a little rusty, but it feels right for the place. Or you could choose to do something about that floor, and it'd probably be easier to clean up, if you sealed the concrete and other things. But it's there's all these moments in the experience we could choose to do something. Not total design. I don't know. This place just sits really well with me, and also probably it's got that authenticity you can't fake or something. So I was feeling really good about this idea, reminding these characteristics, la dee dee dee. I'm happy about some language around some of these ideas that have been swimming in my head since I was, before I knew I was a designer. And then I was sharing these ideas with a good friend of mine who lives in Tokyo. He's running a design studio there for about 14 or 15 years, I think. We'd get on FaceTime, I don't know, once every 6 months or something. We'd pour ourselves a drink or make some tea, do something where I felt we were in the same room and just have this video conversation. And sometimes he'd talk to me about his business, and sometimes I'd talk to him about our life or whatever. And this time, I was I want to share this talk with you and get your feedback. And so I walked him through kind of what I just walked you through, maybe in a little more structured way or something. And he was kind of smiling and nodding. And he was yeah, I don't know, it seems like you're trying to be too right about it or something. He seemed totally underwhelmed about this thing that I had been not only feeling really good and confident about, but also talking out in the world about it. I was I'm gonna go, this is great. I found some new way of communicating the weird stuff that bounces around in my head. It's awesome. Person whose opinion you trust, and they're kind of not so much. And he was are you familiar with Wabi Sabi? Which is a very, of course this is something that my, friend from New Jersey who has lived in, Tokyo for a decade and a half would say. Which, if you're familiar with the concept, you'll probably get why you say it's I would not do it service to try to explain it too much, maybe other than the sense that there's that the sort of incompleteness or rawness or flaws of a thing are perhaps like some of its best attributes. So they are part of its complete, it's sort of like whole experience in some way, right? You can imagine the like aesthetic versions of this and stuff. And I was like kind of angry because I knew he was like right. Yeah. And in fact, so much of my professional experience actually pointed to exactly that, but I was somehow like in denial of it or wouldn't like see it like right in front of my eyes. So I was thinking about like that bar, right, where everything was sort of everything was rough around the edges, and it was all kind of in its natural state in some way. It sort of takes on the characteristics of when it had been made, or by whom, and I didn't. No one tried to change that too much, and that you get this sense of this really compelling experience because there was an active choice not to control or do everything. And I was like, motherfucker, like, damn it. So I kind of had to ask myself, like, how do I rationalize this compulsion for completeness, which is kind of like this thing, I don't know, these like gridded boxes or something. And then like what I've learned really about like probably what is most satisfying to me in life and how little I can actually control in a professional context, which probably looks a lot more like this thing, and sort of like grows in a bunch of directions and is not nearly as like controlled or rational as I would hope for it to be. And that like my self-conception was all about exploring this sort of complete state and all these mediums and all these, all the channels and disciplines, taking advantage of every opportunity. But that like the picture of that pursuit was probably wrong, And that through this desire to kind of like perfectly resolve every solution, I was like missing what made the stuff actually most compelling to me. This kind of idea that like I would, progressively sort of find the next thing to do and sort of conceive it in some perfect form and like add it to the repertoire of like the stuff like a team could do as they're building an organization, or how a brand might represent itself, or the channels or like domains we'd have kind of like agency over as designers. I would always use like architecture as this thing. I'd be like, and then the design team will become the design and architecture team. It's silly in some ways. I still get excited about it, but that somehow you would like add each of these things and then like, yes, we've like done it, we've like made it to the total complete picture with its clear, crisp, defined edges, and we've like, patiently arrived at this like total state. But like the reality of the experience is that like all along the way, like there were all these lessons that said, like in my professional experience, that you can't actually do that. That like the customer or the audience or the context you're designing for like shapes the thing along the way. I couldn't have like planned or predicted that. But certainly like over time, the larger context that you're working under for any kind of project that like takes months or years like shifts. The world is changing like under and around you, and that picture of completeness has sort of evolved. And that there was literally like no way to kind of do all of the things. It was always fractional, and in fact the things that I was proud of were fractional, and they were just somewhere on like this path or pursuit towards some sense of being more whole. And so I was like keeping the static sense of completeness compartmentalized from all these things I knew about how things were better with evolution, better with constant change, and sort of like questioning your output and revising things based on what you learned back. I mean, in the context of Etsy, we had, it was the first time I'd experienced something from a software development standpoint that was like continuous development or continuous deployment or continuous integration or like any of these concepts. And it was so powerful. And in fact, when we built design on top of that and sort of shared those ways of working, we got so much more done and delivered so much more value to customers. But still in my mind, I was like, this thing's got to be about a complete thing. And what I found like, so as I was thinking about this is that like when you're moving in sort of like perpetual motion, and constantly changing things, the holes of that incomplete experience kind of like disappear, right? That perspective becomes another thing entirely. It's about like time and like forward progress, and it sort of like ebbs and flows at times, and it might pulse or do other things, but it changes how you think about what needs to happen next, because I don't need to fill in that gap to complete the picture. I need to sort of move this all into the future, like sort of acknowledging what we've learned in the changing context. And I found like this idea for me, it was, I don't know if it was so much of like an ego check or something, but it also seemed so simple. Like that sort of continuous evolution was really what we were living every day in the professional environment. And yet somehow when I sort of came home at night or I thought about like what was important to me in design, it was this other idea. But I think they can be resolved in this sort of like perpetual motion, and that around this like continuous questioning and ongoing improvement, it's this pursuit of the idea of this like holistic, like total design. It's not so much about the end state. There's probably some cliche like journey, not destination thing in there. And then it really started to dot for me the way of like some other things that have been important and meaningful kind of constructs for myself, which was like one is sort of about how water moves through like land, and basically like you're if you're dealing with a piece of land on the earth, maybe you're building this site or you're like managing a park or something like that, water's kind of your enemy, and you want it to be about like flow and not accumulation, right? It's not about like collecting things in a place, it's rather about letting them to like pass through to their like natural end destination. And I was like, oh, I've been thinking that a long time and using that metaphor. This is the same thing, right? That really I'm not looking to like accumulate all of the designed things, that we've done them all in this complete list, but rather I'm looking to sort of like flow things to their natural next destination and sort of where they ought to be. And the other thing at this really kind of like intimate and personal level, I really like designing. And the idea that you would somehow be like finished with it is somehow really sad and depressing, right? When I sort of like pulled at that thread, and then the alternate idea wasn't to like design all of the things, but to rather like always be designing, I found myself like reinvigorated, that the energy was in that action and not the sort of end in the end state. So I wanted to sort of share that small, weird personal journey and like some, lack of confidence turned question by your friend mess pile into something I could sort of like open up and share with you. So thank you for taking the sort of giving me your attention and time. I really appreciate that, and just again so thankful to be here. So enjoy the rest of the day at Invisible, and I don't know if you want to read about me trying to figure out what it means to live and work in Southeast Asia. This is my newsletter address, and I would love to talk with you there. So I hope you found something here that resonates with you, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.